All right, I want to welcome everybody. This is a terrific and major event in the history of the School of Business and Economics. This is the inauguration of our speaker series, made possible by a very generous grant from the Charles Koch Foundation. And our inaugural speaker is, a distinguished colleague that I've known for roughly 20 years. He spent almost his entire career, 28 years. I apologize for making you seem old.
I am.
Old and wise at St. Lawrence University in upstate New York. And very, very early in my career, I was nearby, about 10 miles over at Clarkson University. Although I didn't meet Steve until much later. Steve has just started as the, you're going to have to remind me, the Schottner.
Schnatter, John H. Schnatter. That's Papa John from Papa John's Pizza, so buy some Papa John's Pizza, keep me John.
John Schnatter, professor of Free Enterprise at Ball State University. So he's just come, not too far to come talk to us. His talk today is going to be on inequality, mobility, and poverty in America. And this is Professor Steve Horwitz of Ball State University.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Bob. Hopefully we're gonna fix our IT problem. I think once IT gets here, it should be like that. That is my hope, because most of my slides are actually data that I want to show you. I can start, though, the first couple of slides I can talk my way through, I think, without the data, because they're fairly simple. So hopefully we'll get this resolved in short order. So let me start by saying my talk today is about the word I have invented to describe this talk. It's about complexifying these questions of inequality and poverty and mobility. Because there are some beliefs out there that people have about the nature of inequality in America, poverty, mobility in America. And what I want to argue today is that the simple version of those beliefs is probably mistaken. Or at the very least, these questions are much more complicated, and the data we might look at are much wider spread than the usual story goes. Okay, so let me give you an example of what I think of as the usual story here, and some hints at what I'm going to talk about. So one element of the usual story is, aren't the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer? We hear this narrative all the time, right? We hear it in the context of growing inequality, okay? And what I'm going to do, hopefully, if IT cooperates, I'm going to show you some data that suggests that, the data that people point to that suggests that that's true, okay? And it makes it look like that might be the case, all right? But what I want to then show is that there's other data that says, wait a second, the story is a little more complicated than that. And in particular, what I want to point out is oftentimes this argument that the rich are getting rich, the poor are getting poorer, makes it sound like the people who are rich in one year are getting richer in the later year, and the people who are poor in another year, in that same year, are getting poorer in another year. And it turns out that's not true. Because what happens over time is who comprises the rich and poor change. We have to take account of what economists call income mobility or income dynamics. Not everyone who's rich in one year is rich in the next year. And more important, not everyone who's poor in one year continues to be poor in the next year. So we need to look at that data to sort this all out. Another aspect of this argument is on the belief out there is that life for most Americans, especially the poor and maybe the middle class as well, has become worse since the 1970s. We're worse off than we were back in the 1970s. Here too, right, there's some data we can point to, flat median household incomes, for example, some other things. But in fact, there's other data that suggests that this is not the case at all. We're going to talk about one way we might measure how well off people are is by what they're able to consume, right? And if we look at how costly in terms of human labor, human time it is to produce goods, what we find out is that everybody's standard of living today is much higher than it used to be. If we look at the middle class, and there's been recent data on this that's come out even, actually I think more recently than what I have on my slide here, right? That the middle class, people say, oh, the middle class is shrinking. And it's true, actually, the middle class is shrinking. But it's shrinking because people are moving up. And I'll present some data to suggest that's the case as well. More generally, poor Americans today, Americans below the poverty line today, are better off by many measures, not all, but by many measures, than the average American was in the 1970s. And in fact, the average American today, average American household, is better off than they were in the 1970s. hopefully I'll be able to show you all this data. Okay? So I have one challenge for you while I talk, though. As I talk, I want you to think about what I haven't talked about. Because we'll come back at the end, and there's some things that as I go through this, that thoughtful critic might say, well, wait a second, what about these things? And so I'm going to ask you to think as I talk, what would be these things that you would put in there? What are the things that seem to be missing from this that people sometimes bring up as examples of why people, for example, might be worse off today than they were a generation or two ago? So that's your challenge as I'm talking, is to think about those things. So again, absent my slides for a minute, let me tell you why people think the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. If you look at, and let me pause one more second, all of my data that I'm using today, all of the data I have are from very standard sources. Some of it's government data, some of it's from other longitudinal studies of households. So there's nothing special. You can go out on the web and find this data yourself if you want. I've also tried, for the most part, to stop my data at about 2007 or 8. And the reason is that the recession in 2008, 2009, and the recovery from that makes this story more complicated. And I want to assert, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, I don't think it undermines the story. It just makes it a little bit more complicated. So I'm trying to stop it around 2007 with the data, and then we can talk later on about what's happened over the last 10 years. Because normally this story is not just about the last 10 years. It's about the longer run trends in American society. So with that in mind, in 2007, the top 20% of American income earners had about 60% of total income. So the top 20% earned about 60% of total income. The next quintile, the upper middle class, if you want to call it that way, about 19%. The middle class, about 12%. The lower middle class, the fourth quintile, about 7%. And the lowest quintile, the lowest 20%, earned about 2.5% of total income. So you can see that's a pretty big imbalance between the 60% earned by the top 20 and the 2.5% earned by the lowest. Help is on the way. The other piece of information that's important here is a comparative one. Right, that's the 2007 data. But what if we compare the 2007 data to data from earlier, say 1979, which happens to be a good data set that we have in our possession. So remember, 2007, the top 20% earned about 60% of total income. In 1979, they earned 49.6%. So that top 20% has jumped from 49.6% to 60%. Meanwhile, in 1979, the lowest 20% had 2.9% of total income. They've fallen by 2007 to 2.5%. Now, one of the things about those numbers is you might think to yourself, okay, well, there you go, right? The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. I suggested already it's not the same people year to year, but let me make another point about this as well, which is even if the percentage that different groups earn of total income has changed in this way, that doesn't necessarily mean the poor are poorer. When I do this with students, this is a sort of half and half audience, but I like to do this with the students. Students, would you rather have a 1/6 of a pizza or a 1/9 of a pizza? Who said that? Say it louder. How big is the pizza? Right, because a 1/9 of a double extra large pizza, right, may well be bigger than the 1/6 of a personal pan. So when we just say the share of income earners, say poor, the lowest 20%, went from 2.9 to 2.5%, it's true, right, that their share, their percentage of income fell, but that doesn't mean their absolute income fell. In fact, their absolute income of the lowest 20% measured this way between 79 and 2007 went up by 18%. That's not much, right, but it's greater than 0, and it's not a negative number. Meanwhile, by the way, the share of income of the top 20%, for those in the 80th to 99th percentile, it went up by 65% in their real income and growth in after-tax income. And for the top 1%, the famous 1%, from 79 to 2007, they grew by 277%. Right? So there's some of the evidence people like to say, aha, see, the rich are getting rich and the poor are getting poorer. But as I said before, we have to take a look at what we call income mobility. And if I had they're working on it. All right, do we have a solution?
We know what's missing.
Okay,
Finding the missing.
the HDMI cord is missing. That's not an HDMI. All right, so while they continue to work, as someone has stolen our cord. All right. If we start to look at income mobility, what we find is that in fact we see a decent degree of change in the percentage, in the different percentages of people, in the number of people in each of the income quintiles and what they earn. So for example, okay, in 1979, we look at, what we want to do here is track individual households. We want to say, look, where were you in 1979 and where were you later? And there's couple of different surveys out there that do this. One that looked over the course of from 1979 to 1980 was US Treasury data for people's income taxes. And there's a second set of data, the panel study on income dynamics, which is run out of the University of Michigan, hardly known as a place that is sort of, you know, shy to talk about inequality, also my alma mater, I might note. The panel study on income dynamics is one of the most respected social science databases in the world. If we look at the data that they have, from 1979 to 1980, we say, of the households who were poor in 1979, how many of those households were still poor in 1988? That is in the lowest 20%. Anyone want to take a guess? How many households started in 79 poor and were still poor? What percentage were still poor in 1988? Now everyone's going, uh-oh, it's a trick question. A guess?
3%.
So 3% were still poor. Everyone else was richer.
Well, they go back and forth.
Right, but from 79 to, right, but from 7, we just look at the 2 points, 79 to 80, 3%.
75%.
75% were still poor.
40%.
40% were still poor. Now we're all over the map. It's like Price is Right.
I go 1. I go 1.
1? Well, I wish 3 and 1 were right, but the number's still pretty good. 14%, right? Only 14% of households who were poor in 79 were still poor in 1988. If you look, of those poor households, about 20% made it to the next quintile up, about 25% made it to the middle class, about 25% again made it to the upper middle class, and 14.7, almost just about the same number that stayed poor, made it to the top 20% 9 years later. And let me remind you, this was during the 1980s. This was the era of greed, right? And the Reagan administration and all those supposedly terrible things, right? Yet, 86% of households who were poor in 79 were no longer poor in 1988. If we look over the longer period, from 75 to 91, we see similar results and even more striking. Who said 3% before? The 3% number is much closer to the 75 to 91 data, right? It was actually 5%, 5.1% of households who were poor in 75 were still in the lowest 20% in 1991.
We have a solution. We
Yes.
have to move to the room across the hall. It means we have to migrate. But
Okay. Could I go ahead and load this for you again? Let's go by the time we're talking about, right? 5.1%. All right, I'm going to jump to the other slide real quick. Oops, not that one. This one, 5.1%. Notice something else, right? Notice that if you started rich, you stayed rich, right? If you started off 62.5% of households who started rich in 1975 were still rich in 1991. So here's a question for you. If all of these folks are getting richer, someone finish my sentence.
Who's getting poor?
What?
Who's getting poor?
Who's getting poor? Where are the poor people coming from? Right? Somebody once said they'll always be with us, right? So where are they coming? Who are the poor people if all the people who were poor are getting richer? Because it's not the rich people who are becoming poor, right? Who are they? College students, raise your hands. What happens when you graduate?
You're in debt.
You get a job, yeah, well, you get a job. You might be in debt too. You get a job. You start in the labor force, sorry to say, at a relatively low income. Who else tends to start in the labor force at relatively low income?
High school graduate.
High school graduates, even better, right? Who else, though? Another group, whole group. Immigrants. Right, immigrants. So who becomes the new poor? It's often people entering the labor force. So one of the things to keep in mind here with this data is that this data, think about how, you know, how snakes digest a large animal, right? People move through this process They start off poor, they get richer as they get older, and they do more stuff, and then people tend to level off as they get to about my age. All right? And so part of what that comparative snapshot data is capturing is just people moving through what economists call the life cycle. Right? That some of the, what looks like inequality is just people going through this process. But if the question is, if you start out poor, how likely is it that you will stay poor? This is some help in answering that question. The answer from this anyway looks like if you start poor, pretty good chance you'll get out of poverty. I'm going to show you some later data that makes this not quite as dramatic as this is. One other thing to think about, those same households that we're just talking about, if you look at how much their actual income changed in absolute terms, so the poor households in 1975 had an average income of $1,200 in 75, all adjusted for inflation. In 91, those same people had households had an average income of $29,000. That is, those people were $27,000 richer on average. Notice that it's the poorer households who gained the most over that period. The households who started rich, well, they were richer at the end, but their gain was smaller. So if we look over that period, it's not wrong to say the poor, everybody got richer, and the poor got more richer quickly than the rich did. Again, this is nothing special. This is just people start off poor usually, and they get richer as they get older. That's what's happening here, right? But the other data doesn't show us that very well. So let me show you on income mobility. This is the same idea. What percentage of households started poor and stayed poor? If we look at 96 to 2005, right, 42.4%. That's a higher number than those other data. Those other data there's been some dispute over them and discussion, and this is a different set of data. This is from, this is more treasury data, right? Still though, over half of poor households in 96 were richer by 2005. This 56% was still poor. Notice something, right? This is only about a 6 or 7 year period. And the shorter the period we look at, the higher we expect this number to be. When we talk about 16 years, 75 to 91, we expect there to be more opportunity for upward mobility. So which data matter here, right, depends upon what time frame you look at. Again, complexifying. One last sort of subtle statistical point here is that as we get richer, these income quintiles expand. That is, it gets harder to jump out of the bottom 20% or out of the middle 20%. Because think about it expanding an accordion or a fan. As we get richer, the distance that 20% takes up is greater. So the same increase in income will not get us out as it would before. So we would also expect income mobility as measured by quintiles to just be less in general as we get richer. So that puts a little extra element into this story. One of the things we might talk about here is what we call intergenerational mobility. How do kids do compared to their parents? I'm just going to walk through this really quick. Okay? Between 1969 and 2000, the children of the top 20% in 1969 had incomes in 2000 roughly the same as their parents did in 1969. So if you were born to a rich family in 69, by 2000, you were likely to be on average pretty much the same as your parents were. However, of the children of the bottom 20% in 1969, 82% had incomes in 2000 that were higher than what their parents had in 69. And their median income was double that of their parents. What this suggests is if you are born to poor parents, you are not consigned necessarily to a life of poverty. Some people don't get out. I'll come back at the end and sort of talk a little bit about that. Because don't take away from this that I'm saying nobody stays poor, right? Because we know people do. Even the data tell us that. And so the interesting question is, who are those people and why? What prevents them from getting out the way many others do? And that's an interesting question we can come back to. Okay? And this is from a Brookings Institution study. So at least there's some significant degree of intergenerational mobility. Okay, I'm actually going to skip this slide because we had to move rooms and this is not the most important thing I'm going to say. Okay? I do want to talk about this idea that labor time cost is very soon. One way we might measure how well off we are is to ask how much time does it take at the average wage, average private sector wage, to purchase various goods and services. All right? So here's some data on that. This goes back throughout the 20th century up to 1997. Just out of curiosity, half-gallon milk. In 1920, if the average private sector wage, you had to work 37 minutes, right? So let's say if the average wage were $5 an hour and a pair of blue jeans cost $30, you'd have to work 6 hours, right, to get those jeans. You can see milk got cheaper, loaf of bread got cheaper through the 20th century, gallon of gas got cheaper. It's a little bit different now, more complicated now. 100 miles of air travel, right, much cheaper. This one has all the fun stuff. Here's my pair of Levi's, which got cheaper, then got a little more expensive. 3-pound chicken, much cheaper than it used to be. 100 kilowatts of electricity. Computing power of 1 million instructions per second, no such thing in 1920. 515,000 lifetimes in 1950. In 1997, 9 minutes. That's 20 years ago. Today, this is in a fraction of a second. Right? And there's the other one I don't think I included on here was the cost of a long-distance phone call. Yeah, there's the giggles, right? Who pays for long-distance phone calls? Us old folks can remember when we did it. Here's some more data. This is a little bit more recent, 1975 to 2006. Right, this is from the Sears catalog. Same calculation here. Okay. One of the things to think about here too is that what this doesn't take into account are changes in quality. So let me talk about the garage door opener here for a minute. In 1975, the cheapest garage door opener in the Sears catalog was a 1/4 horsepower. In 2006, the cheapest one was a 1/2 horsepower. So this one is twice as powerful as that one. So the fact that it costs a little under half as much, you got to double that again, because you're actually getting twice as much horsepower. So it's even cheaper, right? Adults in the room, do you remember what tires were like in 1975? Some of you might remember 1955 compared to tires today. The tires today last longer? Uh-huh. Are they less likely to get a flat? Uh-huh. Right? So that matters here too. Got one more. This is all kinds of stuff. These are basic household appliances. And this is 1973, back when life was supposedly so great. Some of us can remember that year. Okay? It's 1973 compared to 2009. There's the average wage up at the top. There's the percentage change in hours of work it took to buy those things. Right? On average, 71% fewer hours of work for people to buy those basic appliances. And let me mention a couple of things about these things. Who remembers what color TVs were like in 1973? Yeah, right? Not so good. Had a giant 19-inch color TV. Remote control? Throw something at my brother, they can change the channel. Right, that's right. Okay, no, right. And how many channels did you get on it? Yeah, right. So when we think about what a color TV looks like in 2009, right, or even today, and all these other things too. All these appliances are much more energy efficient. They do a better job. Stoves have more features. Coffee pots are better. Toasters are toaster ovens. Vacuum cleaners are more. I mean, all this stuff. If we account for quality, this is even more amazing than it is just looking at prices. Okay. Next slide I want to show is a comparison of what percentage of households, both poor and on average in the United States, have these kind of items in their house. All right, so that to sort of warn you what's coming. Again, a lot of numbers, I know. All right, ignore the two on the right here. Just look at the first four. These are, and by the way, these are not the lowest 20%. These are actually households below the poverty line. The Census Bureau does this periodic survey where they do this, okay? And they sort of survey households. Do you have one of these in your house? And we can see from 84 to 2005, over that 20-year period, families below the poverty line, right? Significant increases over that whole period in all of these things. Okay? Now, freezers went down a little bit. Why? Well, maybe more of those refrigerators had freezers built in. Okay? Microwave, of course, color TV, VCR. VCR, what's a VCR? Personal computers. Telephone, of course, dropped. Why did telephones drop? Right, cell phones, air conditioning. Air conditioning saves people's lives, right? So the fact that so many more people have air conditioning than before matters. Even cars change. Let me tell you a quick story about cars. How many of you have read The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck? All right, good. If you haven't read it, the simplest version of the story is Great Depression. poor American family, it cannot farm anymore. The Dust Bowl has taken their farm. They jump in their old car, they drive across in search of a better life in California. All kinds of terrible things happen to them. Summary, okay? And it was written as an indictment of capitalism during the Great Depression. In the 1940s, the Russians, the Soviets, decided to show the film version of The Grapes of Wrath as anti-capitalist propaganda to the Russian viewers. They did this for like a week and then they had to stop. Why did they have to stop? Because the Russians would watch this movie and go, wait, poor Americans have cars? Right? So this here too, right, is important. So if we look at the last two columns, right, we get a sense of what the middle class looked like in both. This is the average, this is all Americans. In 1971, right, the typical American family was this likely to have those things. Compare that to the poor American family in 2005. Right? By most of those measures, the poor American family is doing better, is more likely to have those things in their house than the average American family was in 1971. And certainly if you look at the average American family in 2005, you can see the gains for the typical American family. You can also compare these two columns, which is interesting too, and notice how that gap is closed. Right? That poor households look more like average households right now than perhaps they did years and years ago. So again, some things to think about here as we think about what do we mean by inequality, what do we mean by poverty, what do we mean by income mobility, how are the poor poorer today than they were in the past. Let me say a quick word about the middle class. This is between 1980 and 2006. And again, this is the way this particular set of data divides things up in these income categories. For me, I would argue this or maybe these two things together are a broad definition of the middle class. Anyone know how much household income it takes to be in the top 20% these days? Anyone want to guess?
250,000?
250,000 for the top 20%? Other guesses? You think that's too high or too low? Too low? Who said too high? What do you think it is if you think it's too high?
130.
That's about right, actually. Yeah, about half 250. Right, is what it takes to get in the top 20%. So you've got two school teachers earning $70,000 a year, married to each other, they're in the top 20%. 250 puts you in the top 5-ish%, I think, if my memory serves, maybe 3%. But anyway, we can talk about what constitutes the middle class here, okay? But if we look at that $35,000 to $75,000 household income group, you can see the middle class has shrunk. But the 75K and over groups have grown, both of them, and especially this one, right? Households making over 100,000. There's more than twice, in percentage terms, more than twice as many as there were in 1980. Again, all adjusted for inflation, right? And notice something else. The households below 35,000 fell by 6 percentage points. The middle class is hollowing out. Oh yeah, because folks are getting richer, right? More folks are moving up. Fewer are poor, fewer middle class, more are above 75,000. If you're interested in I don't know if I connected the internet, I can't show my little thing here, but this is from if I do the Q&A, maybe I will. This is from the Census Bureau, if you're wondering where the source of this data is from. This is a 2009, I think, 2008, 2009 Census Bureau set of data. So this is not like coming from organizations with an agenda. This was, in fact, if you want to be specific, this was the Obama administration Census Bureau. Okay?
You should have internet if you want.
Yeah, I may try that when we go back and see if I can get that. I don't even know if that link is still working. All right, so let me, with about 10 minutes left, let me give you a few kind of closing thoughts. First, let's think for a moment about inequality today versus yesterday. And this is not a data point as much as it is how we think about this question. In the long view of human history, right, the difference between the rich and the poor is the rich had stuff, the poor didn't have that stuff. Right? That was, in some ways, that was the gap between the two. Today, though, the difference, at least within advanced economies, is that the rich have more better things than the poor. But both groups largely have the same thing. Most poor American households have cars. Bill Gates has a car. Probably has more than one, right? He probably has someone who drives it for him, but he's got a car. Poor Americans today can fly in an airplane. So can Bill Gates. Might be his own plane, right? If you go back in time, that difference did not exist. In fact, Mark Cuban, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks, right? This is one of the richest guys in America. You ever seen how he dresses? You ever seen him at a basketball game? T-shirt and jeans. I'm dressed better than Mark. If you ran into him at the mall, you'd never know he was a billionaire. Compare that to historically, right? The differences between rich and poor. If you know Monty Python and the Holy Grail, right? You can think about the scene I'm talking about, right? So, right, those differences, the gap between rich and poor in those ways is much more narrow today, right? Bill Gates has a house with air conditioning, heat, and running water. He has appliances and cars. He has access to life-saving technology. So do poor Americans. Lower quality, fewer, but access. The difference between a Mercedes and a Chevy is not as large as the difference between having a car and not having a car. Same goes for a mansion and an apartment, AC and heat, and running water. The poor today live in ways that the rich 150 years ago could not even imagine. Thomas Jefferson would be envious of the way most poor Americans live today, and how long we live, and how educated they are. We've gone from a society where, for most of human history, the difference was between a small number of haves and a large number of have-nots. Today, the difference is we have a large number of haves and a small number of have, more, and betters. Right? Again, at least in developed, largely Western economies. We can also talk about other parts of the world as well. So one of the ways to think about this is I like to say the good old days are now. So here's an example. 1963, the year before I was born, the average hourly wage was $2.50 an hour. In 1963, suppose you wanted to buy a typical home entertainment system. Those of you who are alive then are chuckling at the idea of a home entertainment system. Well, that's what it would look like. And moderately priced, excellent stereo system. Turntable, those are cool again. Right? Really bad speakers, little weak amplifier. There you go. How much did it cost? On sale, $379.95 in the Sears catalog. In 1963, it would have taken 152 hours of work to earn the money at the average private sector wage to buy that stereo system. You say it's crazy? It's going to get crazy. Today, average private sector wage is $22 an hour. That's now worth $3,344 today. Those same number of hours of work. Ready? Don't forget the 3D printer. Right? For the same amount of work it took a generation ago to buy that stereo system, today you can buy all of this. And notice, right, this is almost a year-old data. I just didn't have a chance to go shopping at Walmart.com before I updated it. So I updated this, but you can imagine this is even more striking today. All those prices are cheaper than this. I just bought a 55-inch version of that TV for less than that price. Right? So again, all those numbers would be even stronger today. All right. So I asked you at the beginning. Right? Well, here's the question. But what about? Anyone? What didn't I talk about today that people seem to worry about as evidence of inequality or the worsening condition of middle class? There's three things I didn't talk about. Healthcare. Healthcare. Thank you. There's one.
Education.
Education, two.
Wow.
Invested assets.
That's not on my list, but that's an interesting one to talk about. There's a third one. So what did we say? We said education, healthcare, education.
Diet?
No.
Nope.
Not who's? Yeah, someone said it. Housing, right? There's others we might talk about as well, but those are three biggies. And let me just say a quick word about each of these and how I think they figure into the story. First, in all three cases, the quality has improved in significant ways. Education will be the most controversial, among those three. So give me a minute to sort of make this case. At least with education, the marginal value of a college degree versus a high school degree is greater than it's ever been before, right? The financial gain to going to college versus high school graduate is bigger than it's ever been before. That's one way of measuring the quality of education, at least the value of education. It's not the only way, trust me. Right? I'm an old liberal arts guy, so I don't think it's the only way, but it is one way. Right? Healthcare. We have new and better treatments that didn't used to exist. We spend more money on healthcare because there's more ways to fix us than there used to be. Many drugs are also much cheaper than they used to be. I take beta blockers for high blood pressure. I pay something like $9 for a month's worth of little beta blockers that as I like to tell my stepkids, they keep me from exploding. Those didn't exist a generation ago. And 20 years ago, they were expensive. 15 years ago, they were more expensive. So it is true, we spend more on healthcare. But we also get a lot more. Housing. Houses are bigger, they're safer, they're better equipped than they used to be. They're built better, right? We could have thrown cars into this discussion, too. When I was a kid, if you got 100,000 miles out of your car, you honked the horn, you threw a party, it was a celebration. Today, if you don't get 100,000 miles out of your car, you feel like you got ripped off. And satellite radio, what is that? Right? Seatbelts, flying around the back seat of the car. These are also three industries in which the government has played a huge role. And that role, I would argue, has led to higher costs and many of the inefficiencies we see there. Just as one example, the housing boom and bust was a product of government intervention into that housing market in a variety of ways, including subsidizing housing, including encouraging banks to issue terrible mortgages, all kinds of ways that government policies, bad policies, distorted those markets. I think the same is true in healthcare, right? And I think the same is true in education. There's a bunch of studies out right now talking about the driver of higher costs in education is the fact that we're more and more generous with student loans. Colleges know that. They know students are subsidized. They jack up tuition. They offer more amenities. They make it more expensive. So when we talk about these three things, at the very least, it's true that they cost more than they used to. And for some families, that's a real issue. But we need to talk about why, right, and what that says, and whether this is something we can... Why don't these things look like refrigerators and freezers and all the other things we've talked about? By the way, one area of healthcare does. LASIK eye surgery, which is almost completely outside the standard healthcare system. If you look at the pattern of the cost of LASIK eye surgery, it matches the appliances and other stuff we saw. And that's because it's separate. It's considered cosmetic, right? And it's outside the traditional healthcare system. But another way to ask the question is, are we really less educated, less healthy, and living in worse houses? And if we're not, and if we have all the other stuff that we saw on those other slides, how are these making us worse off? Again, I don't want to deny that for some number of households, these pose real struggles. But when we look over the bigger picture over a longer period of time, right, we have to ask these why questions. And here's my favorite slide. Are the poor really poor? There's a global question here, too. Right? This has all been very much U.S. data. By the way, there's similar data for Canada and Western Europe. But when we think about other parts of the world, right, and the kind of opportunities they have, notice those are flip phones. This picture's now about 10 years old. These guys all have smartphones now. In fact, their phones do more than your phone does. If you know, these are Kenyans. If you know M-Pesa, the way Kenyans do cell phones to exchange the money, it's way ahead of what we're doing here in the United States. So are the poor really poor? I will stop there, and I will happily take your questions. Thank you very much. First, I should say that. Question?
So what about debt and invested assets and change over time?
Okay, so debt. So one of the, it's almost, every time I do this talk, one of the first questions is, did people finance all these expenditures with debt? So here's what we know about debt. As a percentage of household income, in absolute terms, Americans have larger debt than they did in the 70s or 1950s. As a percentage of their household income, however, it's about flat. What's happened over time is the nature of that debt has changed. It is more credit card debt, and for some folks, educational debt, right? What it used to be way back when, you would have debt, and you would have credit arrangements with particular folks. Okay, I'm excluding mortgages from this, right? But if we think about consumer debt. So we have more debt in absolute terms than we used to, but from what I know of the data, the burden of that debt is no greater than it used to be. So tell me about what more you think about invested assets. Do households just not have them anymore? Is that the concern?
The thought was triggered by one of your tables where if the higher quintile population has the same stuff, or they remained in the higher quintile, they didn't expend as much to, in other words, to move out of a lower quintile, you have to expend. To move into a higher quintile, you wouldn't be able to save or have as much banked.
Not necessarily. Remember, those are measuring, at least the income data is measuring income, right? And notice this is income, not wealth, right? So this means what's your annual intake as opposed to what's the net value of your assets. The wealth data are a little bit different, and certainly one of the problems we know that affects poor Americans, and particularly African Americans in the United States, is that they are notably less wealthy than other groups. And a lot of that's connected to the inability to get housing, to own a house, right? Because the sort of significant wealth asset that average families have is their home, right? The value of the home minus the mortgage. And certainly the mortgage crisis didn't help those matters either. It's also the case, again, right now that interest rates are so low that it's hard to make a lot of money. You know, the incentive to save is not great. So those are real problems, but ones that I think that matter for all kinds of households with all kinds of different income levels. So I think we do have to look at why it is, again, from a policy perspective, why is it, say, that African American households are significantly less likely to be homeowners than our white households? That's an interesting policy question. But notice how we've now narrowed the question down, right? It's not just this sort of big, broad, rich are getting richer, getting poor. We're trying to hone in on what are the particular things that make it more difficult for some folks to get out of the lower 20% or the lower 40%, right? And so both, how many are there, and what are those problems? That to me is the interesting policy question. Other questions? Oh, sorry. Yes, sir.
The higher income people throughout history have always lived on the hill, and poverty has always lived at the bottom of the hill, making the bottom of the hill the least desirable place to live. That's been an inequality since coming out of caves. Has that changed any? Have we lifted the black codes in housing since after the Civil War?
Well, look, it's better than it used to be, that's for sure, right? It's not as good as we might like it to be. We still know that there are, practices ongoing that make it difficult to integrate neighborhoods, things like that. And if we think from a rich-poor standpoint, right, one of the interesting things about cities is that we see this interesting mix of rich and poor at both ends of the spectrum in cities. And it's probably the case that poor folks, urban poor in some ways, live better, they have access to more things than rural poor do. I spent 28 years living in one of the poorest counties in New York State, predominantly rural, and that, it's a different kind of poverty than urban poverty in many ways. And so the growth of cities, and I think we're going to continue to see cities grow as young people want to live there. My kids from my first marriage are 25 and 21, they're both living in New York City once they're in school, right? And I don't think they have any desire to really move, right? So cities are very attractive, right, for folks, and I think one concern might be, do cities end up being where all rich people or middle class and higher folks live, right? And who's living elsewhere? And again, also, we look at cities and housing affordability, oftentimes the product of really bad public policy. There are ways that living in the city could be much cheaper, significantly cheaper for more people if we weren't adopting anti-growth policies and other kinds of things like that. There's reasons San Francisco is so expensive, and they have to do with the kinds of public policy they've chosen. So if we're really interested in sort of broadening out the SES, the socioeconomic profile of cities, we need to look at those kind of policies as well.
I had a question about, you talked about how the middle class is shrinking, but essentially that they're moving up.
Yep.
Well, you always hear about people talk about the middle class shrinking is like a bad thing in America. So like, is according to your data, is that still a bad thing, or is it?
Well, I'll try to get the arguments on both sides. I think the people who say the shrinking middle class is a bad thing, even if they're moving up, right? I mean, that's the question. Somebody who says it's a bad thing, you want to say to them, even if they're moving up, right? They might make an argument that there's something valuable about the sort of mores and practices and beliefs of, quote, middle class America that makes it valuable to have a good-sized middle class. Okay, that's not unreasonable. It seems to me, right, that if the reason the middle class isn't as big as it used to be is that people have more opportunities, are doing better, can better educate, better feed, better house, better clothe themselves and their kids, right? That seems to me to be a good thing, right? That's what we want, okay? And notice too, right, what our conception of middle class is going to shift over time. What it was to be middle class in the 1920s, I mean, you know, I teach in Muncie now, right? Look at the Middletown study, right? What it meant to be middle class back then, what it means to be middle class. I mean, this, you know, everybody's got one of these things. What does it mean now when we talk about these kind of issues? So again, I think that data shows a good thing, right? I want to see folks moving up. And I'm especially happy in that data to see the smaller percentage of households below 35,000, right? For my concern, my first concern here is what does economic change do to the least well-off among us? And I'm convinced by this data that for the most part, right, the 20th and now into the 21st century has been an incredible benefit to the least well-off. They are much better as a result of the sort of power of markets and competition and economic growth than they would have been otherwise. Right? So that to me is the key issue. I'm less concerned about the middle class per se. The middle class is often used as a convenient political football, right? People say, well, I care about the middle class. What do you mean by the middle class, right? And exactly what do you mean? So that's a really interesting and important question. Other questions? Yes, ma'am. And thank you for your help.
Oh, you're welcome. So, one thing that occurs to me in looking at the disparity in incomes is that the top 1%, they have large amounts of wealth. So money equals power in our culture.
It does.
They can donate millions of dollars and get the ear of politicians, get things done that help them. Meanwhile, me, I have a pretty good household income. I can't just call up my congressman and go have dinner and talk about the needs that are happening for me and the people that are in lower income levels. So if we're looking at just the basis of the money and that we've got more money, we have more access, we can get the same things the rich have. The rich have stuff that we don't have, which is power.
And that's bad stuff.
And that's bad.
Yeah, I agree, okay? So 2 points. Is that a problem of inequality per se, or is it, as your last comment suggests, a problem of the power that politicians wield, right? You know, one question to think about is, if we want to take the money out of politics, maybe we should get politicians to stop spending other people's money, right? One of the reasons that money turns into power is because politicians have that power to operate. Now, if we put politics aside, it's true, right? Wealthier people will exercise more power, right? Even in the non-political ways. I think that's just true. The question I think that's worth asking is, do they exercise more or less of it than they used to, and is the power they exercise more dangerous or less dangerous than they used to? Outside that political context, right? Is the economist Keynes once said, better than a man should tyrannize over his own bank book than over other men, right? So I think that's a question here too. For me, right, I would like to level that playing field by making it harder for politicians to do things that help rich people, right? We can start by tackling corporate welfare in all its various forms. We can start by tackling military expenditures as another form of corporate welfare in all. So there's all kinds of things, again, my own view is we could tackle to reduce the power of politicians, which in turn reduces the power of rich people to use their wealth to influence political life. Not everyone agrees with me, suffice it to say. But that's what I would. Other question? Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if I'm related to, I'm kind of hacking on the witch.
Yeah. I saw you.
Well, because I can't separate power and inequality. I don't know how to do that. So but you said, well, that's a bad thing. Okay, but what occurred to me, and I want you to help me understand this, the slide where you said that poor people have all the same things that rich people have. There's a lot of good things. Would you, at least I would kind of consider IU's middle class school. I don't know. Maybe not high middle class, but we're not poor, right? We're college. even as middle-class people, like you said, there's a lot of things we don't have. I don't have as a professional. And a few of my students have. I have a student who told me recently that her mother died from cancer because she called the amazing Cancer Institute that they advertised that, oh, don't worry if you don't know where to go, we're here for you. Pick up the phone. No, we don't talk to you, you don't have insurance. Her mother's dead now. We don't have the same things.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, we just don't have the same
And
things. We don't have the same education. We don't get the same high access to technology. And
so let me be clear what my argument is, right? That I think all of those things, the health insurance one is really complicated by the very nature of our health care system, which is like the worst of all possible worlds. Okay, but the other kinds of things, right? Compared to historically, we actually do, right? Poor folks today are more able
And
to
people
have.
think here about historically, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, I know.
I live it today.
Right, I know.
But
But
we die today.
I'm saying, look, don't miss. My argument is not that poor people and rich. It's not that they're the same, right? But that the distance between them is narrower than it used to be. And I think I'm willing to stand by that argument, right? And there's all kinds of examples we can point to, right? Individual examples that demonstrate the ways in which poor and lower middle class and middle class folks have struggles that rich people don't. But that's always, in some sense, that's always been true, right? It's always been the rich are the rich, they live better. They always have, right? But two things I think are true today. The gap between, on average, the poor and the middle class and the rich is narrower than it used to be. And the poor and the middle class live lives today that are better than it was in the past. And that suggests to me that if we want to resolve exactly the kinds of problems you're talking about, what we need to do is to continue to encourage the same processes that have generated the wealth that's narrowed that over time. And my concern is that bad public policy, including some of the things we've done with healthcare, right? That bad public policy in particular, or misunderstandings of the data and of that history, can lead us to do things that don't continue those trends in the way that they have in the past. That's my concern here, right? I think the reason I like to invoke the historical trend is because it's been a good one. And the question is, how do we continue that? How do we solve the problems that remain, right? And one last point to think about. One of the things we know historically is that we get more upset about things as they disappear because they trouble us more, right? When poverty was the universal human condition, people didn't get upset by poverty. It's the fact that poverty has become less common over time that it bothers us more. And it should, and that's a good thing, right? The same way when we hear these stories of people who can't deal with medical care, right? Because many of us do have access to it, others don't. So it troubles us more, right? Smokers bother us more when there's only 10 of them as opposed to 10. Right? So I think that's part of the dynamic here. And I think part of what we have to do is to recognize that and to think carefully about how do we solve those particular problems, which leap out to us more because they're less common than they used to be. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Yes, ma'am.
So this presentation has been very informative and helpful, but
I knew there was a but.
I'm sorry. Shouldn't we be looking at, how we can change this, how we can make this different versus, how it's increased and changed over a certain amount of time? That's good and all, but if you really look at what's going on, it's really not that great.
So here's what I'll say. Maybe this is a really good place to conclude. If I had another hour, I'd do that much, right? Which is, what do we do, right?
Well, I think that's what we need to talk
Yeah,
about.
and if you guys will have me back, I'm happy to. Hopefully with working tech. But I think before we do that, right? Before we tackle that set of questions, and they're important, I think we need to have a really good sense of how complicated the issues are. Right? And my goal here today, as I said at the start, was to suggest that when we start to look at all of the data we might include in this kind of discussion, suddenly this issue looks more complicated than simply the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, right? Or the middle class is shrinking, right? All of these things are just more complicated. And the fact that once we have a better handle on the data and we appreciate the complexity, then we can start to think carefully about what policies might help. If we say the poor are getting rich, poor are getting poor, we need to tax the rich at a much higher rate, redistribute to the poor, sounds great. But when we start to look at this stuff, it's not clear that will help the problem, right? Or at least it's not clear whether there aren't better, more targeted, more specific kinds of policies that would really help the problems we know are there. And then for me, that's the issue here, right? That's the complexification of these questions. So I will stop there. Thank you all for the questions, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah, our next speaker is on October 10th, the Not So Wild Wild West. Okay, it's a fascinating topic. I've heard him speak before on that. And then you have food in that room. We just came out. You got some pizza and some drinks. So please help yourself.
I hope you all enjoyed this, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.